Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The courtroom was silent, almost solemn. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the faces of the onlookers and journalists who had come to witness the trial of a 16-year-old black boy, Ethan Williams. Sitting in the dock, Ethan stared at the floor, his hands clenched in his lap, while his lawyer nervously reviewed some notes. Opposite him, behind the judge's desk, stood Clarissa Bennett, a black woman in her 40s, renowned throughout the city for her integrity and rigor. Her reputation for impartiality was such that even the toughest lawyers respected her decisions. But today, something in the air seemed different. The whispers grew louder as the prosecution began to present their case. Ethan was accused of shoplifting. The evidence piled up: surveillance cameras, witness statements, items found in his bag. But despite this, Ethan didn't lose his composure. His eyes, dark and deep, seemed to be watching something beyond the room. Then, suddenly, just as Clarissa was calling his name in question, Ethan stood up, out of breath, and in a clear, trembling voice, said, "You are my mother." An icy silence filled the room. The murmurs stopped immediately. The frozen journalists, the surprised lawyers, and even the police officers exchanged incredulous glances. Clarissa, however, remained motionless, her eyes wide open, unable to move, unable to speak. Her heart pounding, she felt a shiver run down her spine. This simple confession would change her life and Ethan's forever. This trial was no longer just a matter of justice, it was the starting point of an encounter that defied time, destiny, and all the silences of the past. The courtroom bell rang, echoing off the marble walls. Ethan Williams sat back down in the dock, his heart pounding. His gaze was steady and determined, but a palpable tension filled it. He'd always known this day would come, but he never imagined it would unfold like this. Judge Clarissa Bennett, dressed in her impeccable black gown, sat behind the lectern, her hands resting on the trial file. Her gaze, usually cold and analytical, was a little softer today, though she didn't understand why. She leafed through the documents, rereading the charges: theft of a luxury watch from a local jewelry store. The witnesses were ready, the evidence laid out on the desk: videos, witness statements, and seized items. Ethan looked around the room: journalists, onlookers, police officers, everyone was there to see how this case would unfold. But for him, none of that mattered. What he saw was Clarissa. He couldn't take his eyes off her, as if searching for something he'd lost forever. Ethan's lawyer, Mr. James Carter, stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we ask that all evidence be carefully considered and that my client be given fair and impartial treatment." Clarissa nodded, her firm voice echoing through the room. "Very well. We will examine the facts in detail." Witnesses were called. The jewelry store owner, a white woman named Mrs. Eleanor Harper, described in detail what she had seen that day. Ethan listened attentively, silent, but his face betrayed no fear. Then came the time for direct questioning. Clarissa looked up at Ethan and asked calmly, "Ethan Williams, what can you say about these accusations?" Ethan stood up. His voice, shaky at first, became more assured as he spoke. But before he could answer the questions about the flight, he did something unexpected. His gaze fixed on Clarissa and, with surprising intensity, he said in a clear voice, "You are my mother." A complete silence fell over the room. The murmurs ceased. The police officers froze, the journalists stunned, and even Ethan's lawyer stood there speechless. Clarissa felt her heart stop. She had never heard those words like that. Everything in her life had changed in a split second. This trial had just taken on a new dimension. It was no longer just a matter of justice for an alleged theft. It was a confrontation with the past, a long-buried secret that was suddenly resurfacing. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Ethan's words still echoed, like an echo that refused to die down. "You are my mother." The murmurs resumed, hesitant, then grew louder. The journalists exchanged incredulous glances, taking out their notebooks to note every moment of this improbable scene. The lawyers leaned toward their clients, whispering in astonishment. Even the police officers, accustomed to handling tense situations, seemed frozen, unable to react. Clarissa Bennett stood motionless behind her desk. Her heart was pounding. Every fiber of her being screamed for professionalism, but her eyes couldn't tear themselves away from Ethan. The boy's features seemed strangely familiar, like a forgotten mirror from the past. Ethan, his face grave, took a deep breath and began to tell. My name is Ethan Williams, and I've spent my whole life searching for answers. I was taken from my mother at birth, adopted by a family that did the best they could, but I always knew that somewhere, she still existed. A murmur rippled through the room. Even the deputy judge seemed taken aback. Clarissa felt her palms grow clammy, and her throat tightened. She knew these revelations weren't simply emotional, they completely changed the dynamic of the courtroom. Ethan continued. I searched for every piece of information I could find. I grew up wondering why I never knew my real family. And today, I stand before you, because I finally found my mother. A shocked silence fell again. The words were weighty, but what made the scene even more poignant was the truth Ethan seemed to read in Clarissa's eyes. The shock of mutual recognition hung in the air, invisible but palpable. Clarissa, her voice trembling but controlled, asked. Ethan, comment. But Ethan interrupted him. I don't have time for legal details. All I know is that I'm finally in front of you, and I want answers. The judge felt she had to proceed cautiously. The courtroom was now suspended in thought. This trial was no longer just about justice for an alleged theft. It was becoming a meeting point between two lives shattered by the past, a confrontation with years of silence and secrets. The prosecutor and defense attorney looked at each other, realizing that the usual procedure had become secondary. Even the witnesses, who were waiting their turn, seemed to be holding their breath, as if the entire room understood that an extraordinary event was unfolding before them. This moment marked the beginning of a story much bigger than just the trial. A story of reunions, secrets revealed, and emotional confrontations that would transform the lives of everyone in the courtroom. Ethan breathed deeply, feeling the weight of each word on his shoulders. The courtroom had become a theater of silence, where everyone held their breath, aware that what was about to be said would shatter all their certainties. I was born in this hospital, Ethan began, his voice shaky but resolute. My biological mother is you, Clarissa Bennett. But soon after I was born, there were complications. You were young, scared, alone in a system that didn't help you. I was taken from your arms and placed in a temporary home, before I was adopted. Clarissa's eyes filled with tears. Each word struck her heart like a clap of thunder. She vaguely remembered that time, a difficult delivery and a decision she believed was necessary to ensure a better future for her child. But she never imagined she would see that face again, 2 decades later, in a courtroom. Ethan continued, tears in his eyes, but with a quiet strength that impressed all the witnesses. I grew up wondering why I never got any answers. I searched for documents, certificates, anything that could lead me back to you, and finally, I found your name. I knew I had to meet you, no matter the circumstances. The entire room was frozen. Even the prosecutor and defense attorney, accustomed to human drama, could not look away. Some journalists' hands were shaking, unable to accurately record the moment, it seemed so surreal. Clarissa, trying to find her voice, whispered. Ethan. I didn't know. I thought. But Ethan cut her off gently. I know what you were thinking, and I'm not here to blame you. I just want to know why we were separated. A heavy silence fell. Clarissa felt 20-year-old guilt weighing on her shoulders. She had made a decision that she believed was right at the time, but it had left a huge void in her son's life. She knew that no words could fill that void instantly. Yet in Ethan's eyes, she saw an openness, a willingness to understand rather than condemn. This mutual recognition, however painful, marked the beginning of a bond that neither time nor distance could erase. And as the courtroom held its breath, it became clear to everyone that this trial was no longer just about theft, it was the beginning of a long-awaited reconciliation, a confrontation with the past that would change their lives forever. Clarissa Bennet felt her world turn upside down in a split second. The murmur of the room had turned into a heavy, almost reverent silence, but her heart was pounding. Each breath seemed heavy, as if time itself had slowed down. Ethan looked straight into her eyes, with an intensity that made her falter. There was in that gaze the pain of 20 years of separation, but also a desire to understand, to fill the void left by absence. Clarissa felt tears well up in her eyes, but she forced herself to remain dignified, aware that she still occupied the role of judge. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know you were here, that you were alive." Ethan stepped forward slightly, as if to bridge the space between them, and said softly, "You are my mother. And I am standing in front of you. All I want is answers, and to know if you ever thought of me." Clarissa rose from her seat, unable to contain the emotion that overwhelmed her any longer. She stammered, I always thought about you, but I never knew how to find you again." Everyone in the room held their breath. The journalists, the lawyers, the police officers, even the prosecutor, all stood transfixed by this single scene. The bond between these two shattered lives was becoming stronger than any accusation, more powerful than any legal proceedings. Ethan took a step forward and almost whispered to himself, "I've been waiting for this moment all my life." Clarissa, unable to remain impassive, finally let her tears flow. The walls of the courtroom, silent witnesses to so much tragedy, seemed to resonate with the power of that moment. The years of separation, the unanswered questions, the pain and guilt, all concentrated in that shared gaze between mother and son. For a moment, the judge and the accused were just two souls reunited after decades of silence. The trial had lost its original meaning, it had become a place of revelations, emotional confrontations, and possible reconciliation. The prosecutor, visibly moved, resumed his notes with difficulty, while the defense lawyer murmured, "Your Honor, perhaps we should suspend the proceedings for now." Clarissa nodded slowly. She knew that this trial, as it had begun, could no longer proceed normally. It was first necessary to understand, to welcome this reunion, and to decide how to proceed with justice and humanity. Judge Clarissa Bennet took a deep breath and lightly rapped the gavel on her desk. The sound echoed through the courtroom, reminding everyone that order must be maintained, even amidst emotional chaos. For exceptional reasons, she announced in a shaky but firm voice, "This hearing is suspended until further notice. We must take into account the personal circumstances that have just come to light and ensure fair treatment for all parties." A murmur ran through the room. Some journalists exchanged intrigued glances, while the police officers and lawyers realized that this trial had just gone beyond the legal framework to become a profoundly human affair. Ethan sat down slowly, his heart still pounding, while everyone else began to leave the room, respecting the silence that reigned. Once the room was almost empty, Clarissa stood up and asked the bailiff to lead Ethan to an adjacent room, out of sight. There, they would be alone to talk, to finally look at each other outside the courtroom. The door closed behind them, and the outside world disappeared. Ethan looked at his mother, his breath coming out of his chest, his hands trembling slightly. Clarissa, her eyes red and watery, tried to find the right words. "Ethan. I don't know where to start," she whispered. Ethan stepped forward and said softly, "Start by telling me that you are really my mother." Clarissa bowed her head, tears flowing freely. "Yes. I am your mother." A heavy silence of 20 years of separation fell between them. Then, hesitantly but decisively, Ethan spoke. "I never stopped wondering why we were separated. I grew up with this absence, this emptiness, but I always knew that one day I would find you." Clarissa approached slowly, her throat tight with emotion. "My baby. I've never stopped thinking about you. Every day of my life, I've regretted this separation, but I had no way of finding you again, until today." They stood there, silent but connected by mutual recognition, by the weight of lost years, and by the hope of a new beginning. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt he was no longer alone, and Clarissa felt that the guilt that had accompanied her for decades could finally begin to ease. The trial could wait. For now, what mattered most was this reunion, this chance to rebuild a bond that time had thought had been shattered, but which remained intact in their hearts. In the adjacent room, away from the hustle and bustle of the courtroom, Ethan and Clarissa sat facing each other. The air seemed thick with years of silence and secrets. Ethan, though nervous, was determined to understand her story, and Clarissa, trembling but determined, wanted to answer him honestly. "Tell me," Clarissa said in a soft but firm voice, "tell me everything you know." Ethan took a deep breath. "I was adopted at a few months old by a white family, the Williamses. They gave me love, but I still felt this emptiness, this absence. I grew up with this constant question, why did my biological mother never look for me?" Clarissa, her throat tight, whispered. "Ethan. I always thought about you. Every night I wondered what was happening to you, if you had a family, if you were happy." Ethan continued, "I searched everywhere. I looked through adoption records, hospital records, associations, and every lead seemed to disappear. But I never gave up. And finally, I found your name." Clarissa felt tears roll down her cheeks. I had no legal way to find you back then. The situation was complicated, and I was young, scared. But I never stopped thinking about you." Ethan nodded, trying to contain the emotion. "I know. And I'm not angry. I just wanted to meet you, know the truth, and, maybe, fill that void." A heavy but soothing silence fell. The two looked at each other, trying to read in each other's eyes all the lost years. There was an implicit promise in this silence, that of rebuilding their bond, of repairing what time had fragmented. Clarissa took Ethan's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've lost a lot of time, but we can start making up for what we missed." Ethan gave a small smile, a mixture of relief and shyness. "I want to get to know you, Mom. Not just as my biological mother, but as you, the person I never really knew." For the first time in years, Clarissa felt a huge weight lifted from her shoulders. The trial could wait, the accusations could wait, what mattered was this moment, this chance to reconnect with a family that no one could ever unravel. A few days later, the courtroom filled up again. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The curious murmurs of journalists and spectators mingled with a respectful tension, everyone aware that this trial had gone beyond a simple legal affair to become a profoundly human moment. Ethan entered, accompanied by his lawyer, James Carter, and a sense of calm he had never known. He glanced at Clarissa, who acknowledged him with a slight nod, a mixture of pride and emotion in her eyes. The prosecutor, visibly still affected by the revelations, spoke. "Your Honor, we understand the personal situation of the accused and the judge, but we are prepared to continue the trial impartially." Clarissa nodded. "Very well. We will resume the hearing, but I remind everyone that respect and dignity must prevail, despite the circumstances." The testimony resumed. But this time, Ethan was no longer alone before the court. He felt his mother's silent, protective presence, even through the distance imposed by the role of judge. Every word he spoke was bolstered by a new strength, the feeling of finally being recognized, of no longer invisible in the eyes of the one who had given life. When the defense attorney asked Ethan to tell his version of events regarding the robbery, his voice, clear and confident, was heard. "I acknowledge that I took this watch, but I want the court to understand the circumstances. It was not out of malice, but out of need. I grew up with deprivation, and this gesture was an act of desperation." Clarissa listened intently, her heart torn between her role as judge and her role as mother. She knew she had to remain impartial, but she couldn't ignore the transformation visible in Ethan. He was no longer just an accused teenager, he was a young man seeking redemption, sustained by truth and reconciliation. The next witnesses were called, but the dynamic of the hearing had changed. Eyes were more attentive, questions asked more cautiously. Everyone present seemed aware that this trial was no longer just legal, but deeply human. At the end of the day, Clarissa made an important decision. "The hearing is adjourned until tomorrow." We must consider all the evidence and ensure a fair judgment. Ethan left the room with a lighter heart. For the first time, he felt his mother's unwavering support. And Clarissa, though emotionally exhausted, knew she had just taken a crucial step toward repairing years of silence and separation. The following days were filled with discussions, testimony, and careful examination of evidence. But for Ethan and Clarissa, every moment spent together, even in court, strengthened a long-broken bond. They spoke in hushed voices before and after the hearing, sharing memories and emotions, finally getting to know each other as mother and son. Ethan was beginning to understand the person behind the judge's role, a strong, honest, and loving woman who had made difficult choices but had always held her child in her heart. Clarissa, on the other hand, was discovering the intelligent and sensitive young man Ethan had become, despite all the hardships in his life. The trial, however, continued. The prosecutor and defense attorney carefully presented their arguments. But the courtroom was no longer just a place of formal justice, it had become a silent witness to a reconciliation and a long-hidden truth. On the day the verdict was due to be delivered, the tension was palpable. Journalists had packed the room, curious about the outcome of the case, most of them unaware of the emotional dimension that underpinned everything. The spectators, however, were silent, aware that something exceptional was at stake. Clarissa, taking a seat behind her desk, turned briefly to Ethan. A simple glance was enough for both of them to feel the strength of the bond that had just been created. Ethan, although nervous, felt supported for the first time in his life. His mother was there, present, and that changed everything. When the jury delivered its verdict, the entire room fell silent. The jury foreman said, "We acknowledge that the accused committed the offense, but we recommend rehabilitative measures and not a severe sentence, given his personal circumstances." A murmur rippled through the room. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and gratitude fill his heart. Clarissa, her eyes moist but proud, gave him a discreet nod, a silent promise to always be by his side. After the hearing, they left the courtroom together, hand in hand for the first time. The courtroom walls had witnessed a rare event, the meeting of two lives separated by time, transformed into the beginnings of reconciliation and mutual understanding. On that day, neither the proceedings nor the verdict were the only important elements. What mattered most was the birth of a rediscovered relationship, capable of overcoming all the years of separation. After the verdict, the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind an emotional silence. Ethan and Clarissa left the courtroom together, their hands intertwined. For the first time in 20 years, they walked side by side, aware that each step symbolized a new beginning. In the days that followed, they spent time talking about everything they had missed: birthdays, academic successes, small victories, and challenges. Clarissa listened intently to Ethan's stories about his childhood, his struggles to fit in, and his endless search for his roots. Each word brought their long-separated lives closer together. Ethan, for his part, was seeing his mother in a way he'd never imagined. She wasn't just the harsh judge he'd seen at the hearing, but also a loving, intelligent, and vulnerable woman, capable of admitting her regrets and showing genuine affection. Their immediate circle, however, also had to adjust. Defense attorney James Carter praised them for their courage and sincerity, acknowledging that their newfound bond had influenced Ethan's approach to the trial. Reporters, having learned the true story, began to tell the tale of a mother and son reunited against all odds, sparking emotion and admiration throughout the city. Despite the media coverage, Ethan and Clarissa decided to protect their privacy. They spent time together in quiet places, sharing meals, walks, and deep conversations. Each moment strengthened their bond and consolidated a relationship that seemed fragile but was actually incredibly strong. Clarissa, in these moments of closeness, began to consider the future with her son. "We have lost time," she said one evening, "but now we have the opportunity to build something real, something solid." Ethan smiled, a mixture of gratitude and serenity in his eyes. "Yes, and I want us to enjoy it. Not just as mother and son, but as partners in life, to make up for everything we've missed." For the first time since his birth, Ethan felt complete, supported, and loved. And Clarissa, even after so many years of regret and doubt, felt that the chance to repair the past was finally in their hands. The small town that witnessed this extraordinary reunion could never forget the day a courtroom witnessed an event that went beyond mere justice, the miraculous reunion of a mother and son. The weeks that followed were filled with small victories and shared discoveries. Ethan and Clarissa made every moment they had stolen from lost time their own, from walks in the park where Ethan recounted his childhood memories, to evenings spent discussing their dreams and ambitions. Every gesture, every word strengthened a bond long erased by time and circumstance. For Clarissa, becoming a mother again went far beyond personal emotion. She decided to support Ethan in his studies and future endeavors, knowing that their painful past could now be transformed into strength. Ethan, for his part, found in his mother's love and presence a balance and self-confidence he had never known. Their story did not remain confined to their families. The local community, moved by this miraculous reunion, began to view the court and justice in a more human light. Inspired by Ethan's courage and Clarissa's open vulnerability, residents showed a renewed respect for family ties and the importance of reconciliation. One evening, as they stood side by side on the porch of the family home, Ethan said quietly, "Mom, thank you. Thank you for everything you have done and for what we are going to build together." Clarissa placed her hand on her son's and replied, "Ethan, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You've allowed me to see that even after so many years, love can be reborn, stronger than ever." They exchanged a smile, a mixture of relief, pride, and hope. The past had been painful, but it no longer defined their present or their future. Together, they had transformed a tragedy into a story of reconciliation and resilience. In this small town, the story of Clarissa and Ethan remains etched in the memory, not as a simple trial, but as the day when a mother and son found each other, defying time and silences to build a new life, full of love, understanding, and promise for the future. And as night fell over the city, mother and son, hand in hand, knew they had finally found their place with each other, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead together.